The plane lifted off without incident, as ordinary as any other flight the man had taken. He glanced out the window, watching the ground fall away, the lights of the city below shrinking into a sea of darkness. Settling into his seat, he let out a small sigh, already preparing for the long haul ahead. The gentle hum of the engines and the faint murmur of passengers created a comforting background noise, lulling him into the familiar rhythm of air travel. For the first few hours, everything felt normal. He checked his watch, 1:47 a.m., just a routine glance. Time seemed to slip by as he absent-mindedly flipped through a magazine, his eyelids growing heavy. He had lost track of how long they'd been airborne, but something about the passing time gnawed at him. He assumed they'd be making their descent soon. He couldn't recall the exact flight duration, but he felt certain they should be approaching the destination. A soft chime sounded, followed by the captain's voice crackling through the intercom. It was a generic announcement, the kind passengers barely paid attention to anymore. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be landing shortly. Thank you for your patience." The message didn't strike him as odd at first, but after a few minutes, something bothered him. The flight felt longer than expected. He pulled out his phone, but the screen was blank. No signal, no updates. His watch still read 1:47 a.m., as if time had stopped moving altogether. Leaning over, he glanced at the other passengers. Some were napping, others engrossed in books or movies. No one seemed concerned. He shrugged, figuring it was nothing. He looked outside again, expecting to see the glow of city lights far below, maybe the faint outline of the landing strip in the distance. Instead, there was nothing, just the same empty darkness and endless cloud cover, stretching out into the void. The hum of the engines continued, steady and unchanging. Yet, the man felt an itch of discomfort. He clicked the flight tracker on the screen in front of him, but it wasn't working either. The map was frozen, unresponsive. He pushed the button to call a stewardess, but no one came right away. The minutes ticked by, yet nothing seemed to change. It was as though the plane had become stuck in an invisible holding pattern, flying in endless circles through the night. There was a strange, creeping sensation in his gut, like the plane wasn't really going anywhere at all. Finally, a stewardess passed by, offering him a beverage with an unnaturally stiff smile. He glanced at her, trying to shake the unease, but something about her seemed off. Her movements were precise, mechanical, as if she were acting out a carefully rehearsed routine without really being present. Her eyes were glazed over, and she didn't seem to register his brief attempt at conversation. The smile never reached her eyes. "Excuse me," he started to say, but she had already turned and moved on, gliding down the aisle without a word. It was subtle, just strange enough to make him uncomfortable, but not alarming. Maybe she was just tired, or maybe it was a long flight for everyone. Maybe he was tired. The man leaned back into his seat, trying to shake off the discomfort. Still, his watch remained frozen at 1:47 a.m., the same time it had shown for what felt like hours. He pressed the call button again, but there was no response. The cabin felt colder now, the air heavy with something he couldn't quite name. The passengers remained in their quiet, peaceful states, but it was as if they were cut off from him, like they were part of a different world. Despite the hum of the engines and the normal sounds of the plane, a profound silence settled around him, gnawing at the edges of his mind. It was too quiet. The captain's voice came again, this time eerily unchanged, repeating the exact same message. "We'll be landing shortly. Thank you for your patience." It was the same inflection, the same tone, word for word. He felt his chest tighten, his fingers clenching into the armrest as the realization slowly dawned. They weren't descending, they hadn't changed altitude, and no one around him seemed to notice. The plane was still in the sky, lost in the night, and suddenly, he wasn't so sure they would ever land. The atmosphere inside the plane grew colder, more stifling, as time slipped further away from the man's grasp. His watch hadn't moved, still frozen at 1:47 a.m., and the outside world remained a mystery, shrouded in unending night. He couldn't shake the feeling that the plane was no longer moving through space or time in any recognizable way. As the hours dragged on, or minutes, he became hyper-aware of every small detail. The mechanical drone of the engines felt more oppressive, as though the sound was pressing down on him, keeping him anchored in this strange, inescapable limbo. He pressed his forehead against the cool glass of the window, hoping to catch a glimpse of something, anything outside. But the darkness was impenetrable, almost unnatural. A stewardess walked by, pushing a cart down the aisle. Her footsteps were too even, too precise, as if she were moving on tracks. He watched her closely, noticing how rigid her posture was, her face fixed in a vacant, unblinking stare. The once polite smiles that had greeted passengers at the beginning of the flight were now hollow, barely masking something far more unsettling underneath. When she reached his row, she turned sharply toward him, her eyes locking onto his with an eerie intensity. The man tried to ask a question, anything to make sense of the creeping strangeness around him. "Excuse me, can you tell me when we'll be landing? It feels like we've been in the air for a while." Her response was immediate, almost robotic. "We'll be landing shortly. Thank you for your patience." The same phrase, the same words he had heard over the intercom, but this time her voice trembled slightly, a small crack in her otherwise flawless exterior. It wasn't much, but it was enough to send a chill crawling up his spine. She turned away without waiting for his reply, pushing the cart forward with stiff, unnatural movements. The man watched her retreat, heart pounding. Something was wrong. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach. The way she moved, the way she spoke, it was all too controlled, too rehearsed. He leaned forward, straining to get a better look at the passengers around him, but no one seemed to notice anything out of the ordinary. They were all absorbed in their own world, staring blankly at screens or resting their heads against their seats, unaware of the increasing tension that gripped him. As the stewardess disappeared down the aisle, he turned back to his seat, trying to convince himself it was nothing. Maybe she was just tired. Maybe the whole crew was exhausted. But the gnawing sense of wrongness only grew. The air felt thicker, almost oppressive, and the hum of the engines took on a more sinister tone, as if the plane itself was part of this growing distortion. Then he heard it, faint at first, like a muffled sound carried through the cabin, a soft, trembling sob. He turned his head slowly, his heart skipping a beat. One of the stewardesses stood near the galley at the front of the plane, her back turned to him, her shoulders shaking slightly. She was crying. It was unmistakable now, the sound of quiet, repressed sobbing, her face hidden in her hands. The man blinked, watching in disbelief. Why was she crying? And more disturbingly, why was no one else reacting? He looked around the cabin, expecting anyone to notice. The passengers remained oblivious, their expressions unchanged, their focus elsewhere. Not a single head turned toward the sound. His throat tightened. He stood up, feeling a sudden need to approach her, to ask if she was okay. But as he took a step forward, another stewardess passed him. This one's face was streaked with tears, her eyes wide and red-rimmed, as though she had been crying for hours. Yet her body continued its routine without faltering, her hands neatly arranging snacks on the cart as though nothing was wrong. The man froze, his blood running cold. The sight of her robotic, efficient movements contrasted horribly with the tears that streamed down her face. She wasn't even trying to hide it, and yet she continued her duties, offering drinks to the passengers who didn't seem to notice her condition at all. Her sobbing grew louder as she moved closer to him. The sound was raw, filled with anguish. "I'm sorry," she whispered as she passed by, though it wasn't directed at him. "I'm so sorry." The man's pulse quickened. Why was she apologizing? What was happening? More stewardesses appeared, each one in a similar state of silent distress. Their faces, once cheerful and composed, were now masks of grief. Their eyes darted nervously, but they never stopped working, their hands moving with the same mechanical precision as before. He pressed his hand against his chest, feeling the weight of growing dread. The stewardess's sobs filled the cabin, a haunting backdrop to the eerie stillness of the other passengers. The crying was relentless, echoing through the space, but still, no one else reacted. It was as if only he could hear it, as if the songs were meant only for him. The captain's voice crackled through the intercom again. "We'll be landing shortly," it said, the tone exactly the same as before, lifeless and flat. "Thank you for your patience." The man stared up at the ceiling, his heart thudding in his ears. The words felt like a sick joke now. The plane wasn't landing. It wasn't going anywhere. And something far worse was happening beneath the surface. He returned to his seat, his thoughts spiraling. The stewardesses continued to break down, moving through the aisles like broken dolls, their faces wet with tears. The passengers around him remained indifferent, trapped in their own frozen states. A deep, unsettling question rose in his mind, a question he couldn't push away any longer. Why was he the only one who could see the tears? The man's chest tightened with a suffocating weight as he slumped back into his seat, his mind struggling to grasp the horrifying reality before him. The stewardesses wept openly now, their tears flowing as they continued their monotonous tasks. The haunting sound of their sobs had risen to a steady wail, a disturbing symphony that filled the cabin like a thick foam, inescapable and deafening. Yet no one else reacted. The passengers remained utterly oblivious, locked in their routines as if frozen in time. The man's sense of isolation grew more intense with each passing minute. He scanned the faces around him, searching desperately for any sign of shared awareness. The elderly woman 2 rows ahead stared blankly at the in-flight entertainment screen, her expression vacant as though the flickering images meant nothing to her. Across the aisle, a businessman tapped away at his laptop, his fingers moving rhythmically but his eyes dull, lifeless. Even the children, normally restless on long flights, sat in eerie stillness, as if they'd been drained of all energy. Time had become an illusion, slipping away from him like sand through his fingers. He couldn't even be sure how long he had been on the plane anymore. It felt like days, weeks, but his watch still read 1:47 a.m. The clocks on the cabin walls had stopped, frozen in place. The passage of time, the comforting march of seconds and minutes, no longer existed here. He ran his hand over his face, trying to focus, trying to anchor himself in reality. But reality itself felt slippery. His head throbbed with the strain of trying to make sense of the situation, of how everything could look so normal and yet feel so terribly wrong. Then something new happened, a ripple in the air, a faint distortion. He rubbed his eyes thinking he was hallucinating, but the distortion didn't go away. It was subtle at first, a faint flicker in the cabin's lighting, like a power surge, but it quickly grew more pronounced. The shadows cast by the overhead lights began to stretch unnaturally, elongating along the walls and floor as if reaching for him. The man's breath quickened. Was this part of the plane's descent into madness? Or was his mind finally cracking under the pressure? He shifted in his seat, his fingers gripping the armrests tightly. The shadows wavered again, and this time they didn't retract. They hung in the air, dark tendrils creeping along the edges of the cabin, warping the space around him. It was as though the plane was beginning to decay, slowly unraveling from the inside. The hum of the engines felt wrong now, as if it were out of sync with the rest of the environment. The sound had deepened, becoming almost metallic, grinding. The cabin felt colder, the air thinner. He leaned forward, trying to glimpse something, anything, that could explain this phenomenon. Then, with a sense of horror, he realized the faces of the passengers had begun to shift too, subtly at first, but increasingly distorted. The businessman beside him was still typing, but his fingers seemed to blur, moving faster than humanly possible, like a grotesque blur of motion. The elderly woman's features had stretched unnaturally, her mouth opening wide in a silent scream that went unnoticed by anyone but him. The children, motionless just moments ago, now seemed to flicker in and out of existence, their bodies warping between moments of clarity and strange, hollow outlines. His heart hammered in his chest, each beat louder than the last. He pressed the button to call for a stewardess again, his fingers trembling. Nothing happened. No one came. The sobbing had become a deafening roar, filling the cabin to the point where he could barely think. Desperation gripped him, and he stumbled to his feet, his eyes darting toward the front of the plane. The cockpit. He had to see what was happening up there. He had to know if anyone was in control. He shoved past the passengers, who sat in eerie silence, their bodies limp and unmoving like mannequins. He reached the narrow galley near the front of the plane, where the stewardesses had gathered earlier. One of them stood there now, her back turned to him, her shoulders heaving with silent sobs. He stopped, staring at her for a long moment, unsure of what to do. The sound of her crying echoed louder in his head than before, filling him with an overwhelming sense of dread. "Excuse me," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the sobs. Can I, can I speak to the captain? The stewardess turned slowly and his heart plummeted into his stomach. Her face was soaked in tears, but that wasn't what paralyzed him. Her features were no longer fully human. Her eyes had sunk deep into her skull, hollow pits of darkness, and her lips quivered, cracked and split as though she had been crying for years. Yet her voice, when it came, was soft, almost gentle, as if she pitied him. There is no captain, she whispered, her voice broken. There hasn't been a captain for a long time. Her words pierced his mind like a blade. No captain. The realization hit him like a cold wave. Who had been making the announcements? Who was flying the plane? He stumbled backward, his breath ragged, eyes darting toward the cockpit door just a few steps away. Before he could react, the captain's voice filled the cabin once again, but this time it was distorted, warped beyond recognition. The words twisted into something garbled, inhuman, a static-laden drone of sound that stretched into a low, drawn-out moan. We'll be landing shortly. Thank you for your patience. It sounded wrong, too slow, too fragmented, like a recording played backward. The stewardess in front of him was sobbing uncontrollably now, her cries echoing through the cabin, louder than ever before. The man's heart raced as he reached for the cockpit door, his hands trembling. He pounded on it, screaming for answers, but there was no response. Open up! Please, someone tell me what's going on. Nothing. Only the steady hum of the engines and the chorus of sobbing behind him. He turned, his mind spinning. The passengers still sat there, utterly indifferent to his cries for help, their faces blurred, their forms shifting like ghosts. He was truly alone, trapped in this nightmare that no one else seemed to acknowledge. The plane wasn't landing, the flight wasn't ending, and he wasn't sure if he was even on Earth anymore. The man staggered back from the cockpit door, his legs trembling as if the floor beneath him was shifting. A deep, hollow pit had opened in his chest, a suffocating emptiness that swallowed all rational thought. The stewardess's words echoed relentlessly in his head. There is no captain. The weight of them crushed him, leaving him adrift in this twisted, suspended reality. The cabin was no longer just a plane, it had become a prison, a purgatory where nothing made sense, and time had no meaning. He returned to his seat, but it no longer felt like a refuge. The seatbelt dug into his waist as if it were tightening on its own, and the fabric seemed to pulse under his skin. He fumbled with the buckle, freeing himself as the distorted captain's voice, warped and alien, continued its endless loop over the intercom. The garbled words had become a sinister chant. We'll be landing. Shortly. Shortly. The cabin was darker now, the dim lights casting long, distorted shadows that crept along the walls and ceiling. The passengers remained in their grotesque, unchanging states, their forms barely human anymore. Their faces were stretched into unnatural shapes, their eyes vacant, skin pale and waxy. Some of them flickered in and out of existence, as if reality couldn't fully hold them anymore. He noticed that even the children's laughter, which had briefly filled the air, was gone, replaced by an eerie silence that made his skin crawl. He tried to focus, to think of some way out, but his thoughts were muddled, spiraling into a labyrinth of fear and confusion. What was happening to him? The plane felt more like a living thing now, its walls breathing, its metal bones groaning with an unnatural rhythm. The sobbing from the stewardesses hadn't stopped. If anything, it had grown louder, more erratic. Now the sound filled every inch of the cabin, a relentless, overwhelming wail of grief that clawed at his sanity. But the worst part was that the passengers still didn't react. Why couldn't they hear it? Or worse, were they even real anymore? A strange, oppressive weight settled on his chest. He couldn't breathe, couldn't move. It was as though the air had become thick, viscous, pressing down on him. His vision blurred, and for a moment he thought he saw something, a shape, moving in the darkness beyond the aisle. He blinked, his eyes straining to adjust to the dim lighting, and then he saw it again. A figure, tall and gaunt, drifting slowly between the rows of seats, its form barely more than a silhouette. Its movements were sluggish, deliberate, as if it were searching for something. or someone. The man's heart raced. He gripped the armrests of his seat, paralyzed with fear. The figure drifted closer, its outline shimmering in and out of focus like a mirage. As it passed by, the air around it seemed to warp, bending the light and casting impossible shadows across the cabin. Its presence was suffocating, filling the space with an overwhelming sense of dread. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure paused beside him, its head turning slowly in his direction. Though its face was obscured by the darkness, he could feel its eyes on him, boring into his very soul. The weight in his chest grew unbearable, and for a brief, horrifying moment, he was certain the figure could see into him, into his thoughts, his memories, his fears. Then it moved on, drifting further down the aisle, leaving a trail of distorted air in its wake. The man gasped for breath, his chest heaving as he struggled to calm the storm of panic that surged through him. But the sense of relief was fleeting. There were more figures now, at least 2 more, gliding through the cabin like wraiths, their movements slow, deliberate, and methodical. What were they? They weren't passengers, nor were they part of the crew. These figures didn't belong here. They didn't belong anywhere. He realized with mounting terror that they were something else entirely, something beyond human comprehension, something from outside this reality. The man shot to his feet, desperate for an escape. He couldn't stay in his seat any longer, not with those things roaming the cabin. He hurried toward the back of the plane, pushing past the passengers who sat motionless in their seats. They felt solid enough, but there was something wrong about them, like they were hollow, empty shells of people, drained of all life and emotion. As he reached the back of the plane, the lights flickered, plunging the cabin into momentary darkness. The hum of the engines faltered, sputtering before resuming, but the sound was different now, deeper, more menacing, as if the plane itself were groaning in agony. Suddenly, the intercom crackled again, and the captain's voice came through once more. But this time it was different. It was no longer the distorted, static-laden announcement. This time, the voice sounded wrong in a far more personal way. "We'll be landing soon," it whispered, though not to the whole plane, just to him. The voice seemed to come from directly above him, as if the speaker were hovering just inches from his ear. He jerked his head up, but there was nothing there. The voice felt intimate, insidious, as though whoever or whatever was speaking could see into his very soul, mocking his desperation. "We'll be landing soon, but not for you." A cold sweat broke out across his forehead. Not for him? The meaning behind the words hit him like a punch to the gut. Was he the only one who wasn't meant to leave? Was this flight a trap? A hell from which he couldn't escape? He stumbled into the rear galley, his pulse hammering in his ears. He had to get out, had to find a way to stop this nightmare. His eyes darted around frantically, searching for anything. A door, an emergency exit, anything that could break the cycle. But the exits were sealed, and even the small windows seemed to shimmer with an unnatural haze, as though the world outside no longer existed. The sobbing from the stewardesses intensified, now almost a scream of raw anguish. They appeared again, moving in slow, jerky motions, their faces twisted into grotesque masks of despair. Their cries were relentless, echoing in his head, burrowing deep into his psyche. And the figures, those dark, spectral shapes, continued their slow march through the cabin, circling closer, their presence growing more oppressive with each passing second. The man collapsed against the wall, his breathing ragged, his thoughts scattered. He was trapped. The plane wasn't just an aircraft anymore. It was something much darker, a vessel caught between worlds, where the rules of time and reality no longer applied. And he was never getting off. The man's back pressed against the cold wall of the rear galley, his body trembling with fear and exhaustion. His breath came in shallow, uneven gasps, his mind slipping further into a dark, inescapable abyss. The stewardess's sobs echoed louder, a terrible chorus that filled the narrow space, shaking the air around him. Their faces, streaked with tears, had become pale and gaunt, barely recognizable as human anymore. Their eyes were hollow, their bodies moving in stiff, unnatural jerks. They were unraveling, just like everything else on the plane. The shadows, those dark, flickering figures, loomed larger now, drifting closer and closer, their presence growing heavier. The cabin seemed to ripple and bend around them, warping reality itself with each step they took. The man couldn't look directly at them anymore. Their forms were too unsettling, too incomprehensible. It was as if they existed outside of logic, their very presence breaking the fabric of the world around them. As they moved closer, the air thickened with a nauseating sense of dread, and the man knew they were coming for him. He pushed himself to his feet, every muscle in his body screaming in protest. His legs wobbled beneath him, but he forced himself to stand, to move, to find some way out. The figures were closing in, the weight of their presence pressing down on him like a vice, suffocating him with their sheer oppressive power. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom again, but now it was no longer the distorted, monotone drone. It was something worse. It was laughter. Slow, hollow, mocking laughter echoed through the cabin, filling every inch of the plane. It reverberated in his skull, bouncing off the walls, wrapping around him like a suffocating fog. It was a sound that didn't belong in the world of the living. It was cold, cruel, and filled with malice, as if whatever was speaking to him now was feeding on his terror. "You've been such a patient traveler," the voice crooned, its tone sickly sweet, dripping with mockery. "But patience won't help you anymore." It never was going to. The man stumbled down the aisle, his eyes darting wildly for an escape route. But the plane had warped beyond recognition. The rows of seats seemed to stretch infinitely, the walls twisting and shifting like they were alive, pulsating with a dark, unnatural energy. The windows, once portals to the outside world, were now black, as though the plane was no longer flying through any known sky, but suspended in some endless, empty void. Desperation clawed at his throat. Was there no way out? His heart raced, pounding against his chest, as if it were trying to break free of his ribcage. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The walls seemed to close in around him, the narrow aisle becoming a twisted tunnel, leading him deeper into this nightmare. Then something caught his eye, a movement, just ahead. A flicker of light, a shimmer in the oppressive darkness. An emergency exit. For a moment, hope flickered in his chest. His body surged forward, propelled by a primal instinct to survive. The exit was just within reach. If he could just get to it, if he could just open the door, maybe he could escape this madness. Maybe he could break free. But as he approached the door, the laughter over the intercom grew louder, more sinister. It twisted into something dark and malevolent, a sound that vibrated through his bones, chilling him to the core. "Do you really think there's a way out?" the voice whispered. "There's no escape from this flight. You're not a passenger anymore. You're part of the plane now." The words hit him like a sledgehammer, freezing him in place. He stared at the emergency exit, his hand hovering just inches from the door handle. His breath came in shallow, ragged bursts, and the truth crashed over him like a tidal wave. This wasn't just a flight, it wasn't even a plane anymore. It was something else, something alive, and it had trapped him. The man's hand shook as he grasped the handle, pulling on it with all his strength. But the door didn't budge. It was sealed tight, fused to the rest of the aircraft as if it had never been a door at all, just a cruel illusion, a trick to give him false hope. The laughter from the intercom grew deafening, filling his ears with its vicious taunts. "Go ahead, try to leave," the voice jeered. "But where would you go? There's nothing out there, nothing but endless night." The man slumped to the floor, his back against the cold metal of the door. His chest heaved with sobs, his throat raw with the weight of despair. He was trapped. There was no way out. The plane had become his prison, and now he understood what the captain's voice had meant. He wasn't going to land, not ever. As the realization sank in, the shadowy figures loomed closer, circling him now, their forms stretching and warping, consuming the space around him. The air grew colder, darker, and the plane itself seemed to hum with a new, terrifying energy, as if feeding on his hopelessness. The man's eyes flickered with fear as the first figure leaned in, its shape impossible to define, its presence overwhelming. It spoke without words, but its meaning was clear. This was the end. The sobbing stewardesses, the endless flight, the distorted passengers. It had all been leading to this. He had become part of the plane, part of the nightmare. and now he was no longer sure if he had ever been real at all. Maybe this was his fate from the beginning, an eternal journey with no destination, no escape. As the shadows engulfed him, the last thing he heard was the captain's voice. Clear, calm, and final. "Thank you for flying with us." The plane went silent. The sobs, the figures, the distortion, it all vanished, swallowed by the void. And the man, like everything else, became one with the plane, lost in its endless journey through darkness. The terminal buzzed with the low hum of travelers, families reuniting, business people typing furiously on laptops, and the occasional child's laughter cutting through the air like a brief, joyous melody. David Reynolds walked through this bustling scene, his eyes heavy with fatigue. He was returning home after a week of endless meetings and late nights, craving nothing more than the comfort of his family and the familiarity of home. The rhythmic announcements of flight schedules echoed around him, blending into the background like white noise. David approached Gate 27, where a slender, impeccably dressed flight attendant stood, her smile wide but her eyes betraying an unsettling flicker of something dark beneath the surface. He felt a chill as he passed her, but shook it off, attributing it to the artificial chill of the air conditioning. After boarding, he settled into his seat by the window, the worn fabric cradling him like an old friend. As the plane taxied down the runway, he gazed out at the fading light, the sun melting into the horizon like a dying ember. It was beautiful, but there was an odd stillness in the air that made him uneasy. Passengers chatted in low voices, and David noticed a few were unusually quiet, their faces pale and taut, as if they were waiting for something terrible to happen. Once airborne, the plane leveled off, and the flight attendants began their routine service. The same attendant approached David again, her smile now too wide, stretching almost unnaturally. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Reynolds," she chirped, handing him a folded piece of paper. "Here's your in-flight checklist." He unfolded it, the paper feeling oddly coarse against his fingertips. The rules were scrawled hastily, each word imbued with a disconcerting urgency. Do not look out the window after 10:13 p.m. If you hear a voice whispering your name, do not react. Keep your seatbelt fastened at all times. Do not engage with passengers who appear distressed. If the lights flicker, Mingham. His heart sank as he read the rules. Were these some kind of joke? He glanced around the cabin, trying to gauge the reactions of the other passengers, but they all seemed engrossed in their own worlds. The woman in the patterned dress beside him was tapping her phone, her fingers moving erratically, while the man across the aisle whispered to himself, his brow furrowed as though deep in troubled thought. David crumpled the list in his fist, dismissing it as an odd airline quirk meant to entertain passengers during the flight. Yet a prickling unease settled in the pit of his stomach. Why would a flight attendant hand him a list like that? The flight attendant reappeared a few minutes later, her presence somehow more oppressive this time. "Everything is in order, Mr. Reynolds," she said, her voice smooth and calming, but laced with an unsettling undercurrent. "Enjoy your flight." She moved on, her gaze lingering for just a moment longer than necessary, leaving David feeling like a specimen under examination. As they soared higher into the evening sky, the cabin began to hum with an unsettling energy. David glanced out the window, the vast expanse of clouds glowing in the fading twilight. But beneath the beautiful facade, he could feel an inexplicable tension in the air, as if something were lurking just beyond the edges of reality. Time passed, and the flight continued uneventfully until the clock approached 10 o'clock p.m. The cabin lights flickered for a split second, and David's heart raced as he glanced nervously at the list again. He felt a tight knot form in his chest, the warning echoing in his mind. He bit his lip, determined to ignore the rising sense of dread. Suddenly, a low, incoherent mumble erupted from the back of the cabin, cutting through the hum of the engines. David turned to look, but he could see nothing unusual. A moment later, he noticed the woman beside him stiffen, her eyes wide and glassy. "They're coming," she whispered, barely audible. "We have to follow the rules. Please, don't look." Her sudden fear sent a chill down David's spine. He realized the strange behaviors he'd dismissed earlier were much more serious. As he shifted in his seat, trying to process the mounting anxiety around him, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were all being watched, that something sinister was unfolding just out of sight. And as the clock ticked closer to 10:13 p.m., David felt the weight of the list in his pocket, its rules now looming over him like a dark cloud, promising an unfathomable terror that awaited in the shadows of the night. The cabin settled into an uneasy quiet as the plane sliced through the night sky, the rhythmic hum of the engines a constant reminder of their high-altitude confinement. David clutched the armrests, a thin sheen of sweat forming on his brow. The atmosphere felt heavy, thick with unspoken fears. It was as if the very air around him had grown dense, wrapping him in a suffocating shroud of dread. As the clock inched toward 10:13 p.m., the low murmur of voices intensified, an unsettling chorus of hushed whispers swirling around him. David tried to focus on the view outside, hoping the beauty of the night sky could quell the unease gnawing at him. But with each passing minute, the landscape outside grew darker, the cloud morphing into monstrous shapes that writhed and twisted against the backdrop of an inky void. His eyes flicked back to the list, its ominous words pressing against his mind like a vice. If you hear a voice whispering your name, do not react. The voice, his name, drifted toward him like a sinister caress. He shivered, suppressing the urge to respond. Had he imagined it? Or was it real? David strained to listen, heart pounding in sync with the whispers around him, a disorienting cacophony that seemed to echo within the very walls of the aircraft. In a moment of clarity, he turned to the woman beside him. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. But she didn't respond, her gaze locked onto the seat in front of her, her fingers trembling as they danced over the screen of her phone. It was as if she was trapped in a trance, oblivious to the chaos brewing around her. The overhead lights flickered again, plunging the cabin into darkness for a heartbeat. David's breath quickened as panic clawed at him. Was this part of the rules? Did it mean something? The flickering lights cast eerie shadows across the faces of the passengers, illuminating expressions twisted in fear and desperation. He glanced at the man across the aisle. His eyes were wide, glistening with unshed tears, muttering fervently under his breath as if trying to ward off unseen demons. Suddenly there was a commotion from the back of the plane. David turned just in time to see a figure stand abruptly, their chair scraping against the floor, and within a heartbeat they were gone. One moment they were there, the next, nothing but an empty seat and a lingering chill in the air. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, filling the cabin like a living thing. David felt a sinking sensation in his stomach. Where did they go? He thought, panic rising. The realization struck him. These passengers were disappearing, one by one, swallowed by the darkness that seemed to seep into the very fabric of the plane. A cold sweat broke out along his brow, and he desperately glanced around, looking for someone, anyone, who might still be tethered to reality. Do not engage with passengers who appear distressed, the rules echoed in his mind. But could he really ignore what was happening? His instinct screamed at him to do something, anything, to fight back against the encroaching madness. The flight attendant reappeared, her face inscrutable, and leaned toward David with a forced smile. Everything is under control, Mr. Reynolds, she said, her voice silky but somehow hollow, as if she were reciting lines from a script written in a language he could not understand. Just relax and follow the guidelines. The words sent a shiver down his spine, but he couldn't bring himself to question her. Instead, he tried to focus on the rules, seeking comfort in their structure amidst the chaos. But the whispers had turned into a storm now, swirling in a deafening crescendo. David, help us, they pleaded, the voices blending into an agonizing chorus that pierced his very being. Time twisted and stretched around him, distorting reality like a funhouse mirror. The cabin felt alive, throbbing with energy, and the lights flickered once more, plunging him into darkness. His heart raced as the shadows coiled around him, whispering secrets he could not decipher. Just breathe, he told himself, but his mind raced in a futile effort to grasp the spiraling fear. David turned his gaze back to the window, and the night outside had morphed into a swirling abyss. He could feel the pull of the void, a seductive promise that lurked just beyond the glass. It beckoned him with a familiarity that sent chills down his spine. Was it merely the darkness of the night, or something more sinister? As the clock inched closer to 10:13 p.m., he could feel the pressure building around him, a tidal wave of dread ready to crash down. The whispers crescendoed into frantic cries, and he felt himself being swept along in the chaos. He gripped the seat tightly, teeth clenched, battling the rising tide of fear. He was losing control, slipping into a nightmare he couldn't escape. Just then, the lights flickered one last time, plunging everything into pitch darkness. And the last thing David heard before the silence fell was the voice, sweet and seductive, whispering directly into his ear, "You're next." And in that moment, he knew he was teetering on the edge of something terrifying, caught in a descent he could not stop. The clock struck 10:13 p.m. with a jarring chime that echoed through the darkness like a death knell. David's heart raced, and his breath hissed in his throat as he felt an invisible weight pressing down on him. The cabin was suffocating, the silence palpable, broken only by the eerie whispers that danced just out of reach of comprehension. It was as if the very essence of the plane was alive, teetering on the brink of madness. In the darkness, the shadows seemed to pulse, swirling around him with a hunger that sent chills down his spine. "Do not look out the window," the rule echoed in his mind, but the compulsion was overwhelming. His instincts screamed for him to confront whatever lay outside, to face the terror lurking beyond the glass. He hesitated, the thin barrier of the plane suddenly feeling like a fragile shield against an unimaginable horror. With a sudden surge of adrenaline, David turned his gaze toward the window. The void outside had transformed into a surreal nightmare. The clouds twisted and churned like a stormy sea, illuminated intermittently by flashes of distant lightning that cast grotesque shapes against the inky blackness. Faces seemed to emerge within the clouds, contorted in anguish, mouths wide in silent screams. It was a haunting tableau that threatened to shatter his already frayed sanity. In that moment, a low rumble filled the cabin, growing louder until it drowned out the whispers. The plane shuddered violently, and David's grip on his seat tightened. He could feel the very structure of the aircraft straining against the unseen forces pressing in from all sides. Panic surged as he realized the turbulence wasn't just from the storm outside. It was something far more sinister. He turned to the woman beside him, desperate for a sense of grounding. "Did you see that? The faces," he shouted, his voice rising above the growing cacophony. But she remained frozen, her eyes vacant and glazed, oblivious to the horrors unfolding around her. "Don't look," she muttered, her voice barely a whisper, as if she were trying to shield herself from the truth. "You'll attract their attention." With dread pooling in his stomach, David felt the weight of the rules pressing down on him. They were no longer a mere guideline. They had become a lifeline amidst the chaos. Yet, as the turbulence intensified, his resolve began to crumble. The shadows in the cabin twisted into grotesque forms, mirroring the torment outside, and he could feel the whispers of lost souls clawing at the edges of his mind. Then, in a moment of sheer desperation, he resolved to break free from the constraints of fear. The voice had returned, seductive and urgent, a whisper that curled around his thoughts like smoke. "React, David. Fight back." It wrapped around him, promising freedom from the nightmare, urging him to confront the shadows that loomed just beyond his sight. With a surge of defiance, he stood, his heart pounding like a war drum. "No, I won't be a part of this," he shouted, his voice echoing in the darkness. "I refuse to let you take me." The cabin trembled as if in response to his defiance, the lights flickering erratically, casting fleeting glimpses of passengers caught in their own private hells. As David faced the shadows, they began to solidify, coalescing into dark figures that loomed in the aisles, their faces twisted with anguish, mouths open in silent screams, eyes hollow and devoid of light. They reached for him, fingers elongated and claw-like, desperate to drag him into their eternal torment. The whispers rose into a frenzied crescendo, urging him to join them, to succumb to the despair that suffocated the cabin. His instincts screamed for him to flee, but he stood firm, channeling his fear into a shield of defiance. He remembered the list, the warnings, and the fractured realities of his fellow passengers. "You won't take me," he shouted again, louder this time, a rallying cry against the encroaching darkness. The shadows recoiled at his words, momentarily stunned, and for the briefest instant, the cabin was illuminated by a flickering light. He saw the true faces of the passengers around him, hollow shells trapped in their own nightmares. Some were writhing in terror, others whispering incomprehensibly to themselves, their eyes glazed over as if they were lost in a trance. But amid the chaos, David spotted a flicker of recognition in the eyes of one man, seated 2 rows ahead. The man met David's gaze, a glimmer of desperation shining through his own fear. In that moment, David realized he wasn't alone in this struggle. There were others who felt the weight of the rules, others who were just as terrified and desperate to break free. The shadows surged forward again, but this time David wasn't willing to back down. "We have to fight together," he called out to the passengers, his voice filled with urgency. "We can't let them take us. Remember who you are." The man nodded, breaking free from his stupor. He rose to his feet, rallying the others to follow suit. The cabin began to buzz with renewed energy as the remaining passengers slowly shook off their trances, some rising to join David in defiance. They formed a trembling line, a fragile barrier against the darkness, the flickering lights casting their determined silhouettes against the walls of despair. The shadows hesitated, swirling uneasily as if the collective will of the passengers was a force they had not anticipated. David felt a surge of hope. Perhaps the rules had bound them, but together they could break free from the grip of terror. The whispers shifted, now filled with confusion and frustration, echoing their fears as they clashed against the passengers' resolve. But just as victory felt within reach, the cabin lights flickered violently, plunging them into darkness once more. The shadows surged forward with renewed fury, a tide of despair threatening to engulf them. David's heart raced as he fought to hold on to the flickering flame of hope. The struggle was far from over, and he realized that the rules were just the beginning of a far more harrowing journey. The cabin trembled as the darkness surged around them, the oppressive weight of despair tightening like a noose. David felt the adrenaline coursing through his veins, his heart pounding in defiance against the encroaching shadows. With the flickering lights casting brief, chaotic glimpses of terror, he rallied the remaining passengers, their faces a mixture of fear and determination. "Stay together," he shouted, his voice cracking but resolute. The once fractured group now stood united, their resolve strengthening against the tide of darkness. Each passenger gripped their seat or their neighbor's arm, creating an unbroken chain of shared fear and defiance. As the whispers grew louder, drowning out the roar of the engines, David could feel their chilling touch creeping into his mind. "You will never escape," they taunted, the voices rising in a discordant symphony that reverberated through the cabin. "You are ours." Each word echoed with a palpable menace, laced with the anguish of countless souls trapped within the abyss. The shadows began to take shape once more, coalescing into figures that seemed to mock the passengers' defiance. David's vision narrowed as he focused on the man from earlier, now standing resolutely at the front of the group. "We can't let them take us," David urged, glancing at the other, his voice barely breaking through the cacophony of despair. "We have to remember who we are." With a collective nod, the group began to chant, their voices rising in a desperate hymn against the darkness. "We are here. We are real." The shadows recoiled momentarily, wavering as if the very essence of their unity was a light shining into the depths of the void. But the darkness was relentless. It surged forward, breaking through their fragile barrier, and David felt a cold, clammy hand grasp at his wrist, pulling him toward the shadows. "Join us," the figure hissed, its breath foul and acrid. "You cannot fight what you are." David's heart raced, panic flooding his senses. He could feel the pressure building around him, the whispers wrapping around his mind like a shroud. "No!" he screamed, wrenching his arm free from the spectral grip. "I won't let you take me." With a surge of desperation, he turned to face the others, their eyes wide with fear but ignited by his defiance. "Together," he cried, feeling their collective energy pulse through the air. "We can push back." The group began to chant louder, their voices echoing off the walls, a powerful wave of sound that reverberated through the very core of the aircraft. The darkness shuddered, the figures faltering as if caught in a tempest of conflicting energies. "You are not alone," David urged, his voice gaining strength. "We are all here, we fight together." As they chanted, the cabin lights flickered violently, casting strange shadows that danced around them. But within the case, a shimmering light began to emerge from the center of their gathering. David could feel it, an ethereal glow igniting their shared courage, pushing back against the suffocating darkness. The figures hissed and recoiled, their forms wavering as the passengers began to coalesce around the light, drawing strength from one another. The cabin vibrated with energy, the air thickening with a palpable sense of hope. Yet even as the tide began to turn, David felt a pulse of dread at the back of his mind, the knowledge that the rules still loomed over them like a storm cloud, ready to unleash its fury. Then, as if sensing their newfound strength, the shadows lunged forward, a whirlwind of darkness and despair, their whispers intensifying into a deafening roar. "You cannot escape," they screamed, a cacophony of voices clawing at the edges of reality. "You are ours." In that moment, David's resolve wavered as he felt the weight of despair crash over him. The shadows poured into the cabin like a flood, swirling around the passengers, wrapping them in tendrils of darkness that threatened to suffocate their hope. The light flickered, dimming under the onslaught, and David felt a sense of desperation claw at his throat. "Fight back," he gasped, urging the others to hold on. But then a realization struck him. He remembered the list, the rules that had felt like chains binding them in fear. What if they were not just warnings, but keys to their liberation? "The rules," David shouted, his voice rising above the chaos. "We can use them. They've kept us alive this long. Maybe they hold the power to set us free." "Do not look out the window after 10:13 p.m. He recalled the words tumbling from his lips as he fought to regain control of the situation. "If you hear a voice whispering your name, do not react. Keep your seatbelt fastened. These rules, they're our lifeline." As the words tumbled from his mouth, the passengers began to nod, clinging to the remnants of their sanity. They recited the rules together, their voices weaving a tapestry of strength against the shadows that surrounded them. The flickering light began to brighten once more, pushing back against the encroaching darkness. And then, as they united in their chant, the shadows began to waver, their forms flickering like the dying embers of a fire. The whispers turned into screams of rage and frustration, reverberating through the cabin as the shadows fought against the collective will of the passengers. "You cannot control us," David shouted, his voice breaking through the chaos. "We are more than your puppets." The shadows shrieked, a cacophony of despair echoing around them, and for a fleeting moment, the darkness recoiled as the light expanded, filling the cabin with a brilliant glow. David felt a surge of power rush through him, a connection to his fellow passengers that ignited the flickering hope in their hearts. But just as it seemed they were winning, a sudden burst of darkness surged through the cabin, sending David sprawling to the floor. The light flickered violently, threatening to extinguish. He felt the tendrils of despair wrap around him, squeezing tighter as the whispers returned, this time more sinister than before. "Join us," they urged, their voices dripping with temptation. "You will never escape." David fought against the darkness, the weight of despair threatening to consume him whole. The rules echoed in his mind, but he felt himself slipping. Just as his vision blurred, a pair of hands gripped his shoulders, grounding him. He looked up to see the man from earlier, determination shining in his eyes. "We can do this," the man shouted, pulling David back to his feet. "Together." In that moment, David's resolve reignited. He could feel the energy of the group surging around him, a shared understanding that they were in this together. They weren't just passengers on a plane, they were warriors fighting against the encroaching void. With renewed strength, David joined the chant, their voices intertwining in a powerful declaration of their existence. And as they pushed back against the shadows, David felt a flicker of hope in the depths of despair, knowing they were inching closer to the breaking point of the nightmare that surrounded them. The cabin trembled violently as the darkness writhed around them, the shadows coiling and twisting like a living entity seeking to consume everything in their path. David felt the collective strength of the passengers surge around him, a lifeline woven from a shared resolve and unyielding determination. Each chant, each shout grew louder, a thunderous rally against the despair that threatened to overwhelm them. "Remember who you are," David cried, his voice rising above the chaos, igniting a flicker of defiance in the hearts of those around him. "We are real. We are here." The shadows writhed, momentarily stunned by the power of their collective will. As they continued to chant the rules, a radiant light began to pulse from within the group, illuminating the cabin and pushing back against the encroaching darkness. David felt it coursing through him, an energy that lifted him off the ground and filled him with courage. It was as if their shared belief in each other was creating a barrier that the shadows could not breach. But the darkness wasn't finished yet. It swelled with a vengeful roar, an agonizing chorus that sent waves of dread crashing through the cabin. David could feel it clawing at his mind, the whispers becoming a cacophony of despair. "You will never escape," they screamed, echoing his deepest fears. In that moment, David's heart sank as he glanced around. Some passengers had begun to falter, their faces twisted in fear as the shadows lunged toward them, hungry for despair. He felt a pang of desperation surge within him. No, not now. He fought against the wave of panic, forcing himself to focus on the light radiating from their group. "Look at me," David shouted, locking eyes with the man who had helped him earlier. "We can't let them take us. Remember your name. Remember why you are here." The man nodded, the flicker of resolve returning to his eyes, and he turned to the others, urging them to remember their identities, their lives before the flight. As the chant grew louder, the darkness began to recoil, its form shifting uneasily, as if it were being torn apart by the light. David felt the energy building, coalescing into a blinding brilliance that pushed against the shadows, forcing them to retreat. The whispers transformed into shrieks of rage, echoing through the cabin as the shadows lashed out, desperate to regain their grip. "Fight back!" David cried, feeling the surge of strength from the group swell. "Together we can break free. We are not victims. We are survivors." The chant morphed into a mantra of unity, a shared declaration of their existence, fueling the light that radiated through the cabin. The darkness writhed and twisted, the shadows stretching toward them, seeking to ensnare them in their grasp. David felt the cold fingers of despair clawing at him, threatening to drag him into the void. But he stood firm, the collective will of the group bolstering his resolve. Suddenly, the flight attendant reappeared, her face twisted in a malevolent grin. "You think you can escape?" she taunted, her voice dripping with contempt. "You belong to the shadows now." David felt a surge of fear, but it quickly transformed into defiance. "No, you are not real," he shouted, his voice cutting through the darkness like a knife. "You are nothing but a figment of our fear." The passengers surged forward, their voices intertwining in a crescendo that reverberated through the cabin. The light pulsed brighter, illuminating the faces of the shadows that had once seemed terrifying, revealing their tortured expressions. Each face echoed a story of despair, lost souls who had succumbed to the darkness. "We will not be like you," David declared, the light reaching its zenith as it pushed back against the shadows, casting them into an agonizing retreat. The whispers morphed into a symphony of anguish, but they were growing fainter, the power of their collective will stripping away the darkness layer by layer. In one final surge, David led the charge, the passengers rallying behind him. "We are here. We are alive. We will not be silenced." The light exploded from their midst, engulfing the cabin in a blinding brilliance that obliterated the shadows, banishing them into the void from which they came. The shadows shrieked, their forms dissipating into the ether, and the cabin vibrated with an intense energy that seemed to pulse with the beat of their collective hearts. David felt the oppressive weight of despair lift, replaced by a sense of lightness and relief. The darkness had been vanquished, the whispers silenced, and the air around them filled with a warmth that chased away the chill. As the blinding light began to fade, David opened his eyes, feeling the ground solid beneath him once more. He stood in the cabin, surrounded by the other passengers, their faces illuminated by a gentle glow. The flight attendant was gone, her menacing presence dissipated into nothingness. With the shadows vanquished, David felt a sense of profound relief wash over him. The nightmare was over, but he knew the journey had changed him. They had faced the darkness together, and in that moment of shared strength, they had forged an unbreakable bond. As the plane continued its journey through the night sky, David looked around at the faces of those who had fought alongside him. They were no longer just passengers on a flight. They were survivors, warriors who had emerged from the depths of despair, united in their triumph over the darkness. And as the first light of dawn broke through the clouds, David knew they had not just escaped the shadows. They had reclaimed their lives. With newfound strength, he whispered a silent promise to himself. He would never forget this experience, nor the power of unity in the face of unimaginable horror. Ethan Hollis stood at the airport terminal, a cacophony of voices and hurried footsteps swirling around him like a tempest. The air felt thick, charged with the tension of travelers embarking on journeys, unaware of the specters that lingered just beneath the surface of their excitement. He clutched his boarding pass, the paper crumpled in his sweaty palm, a stark reminder of the impending flight that brought both dread and a flicker of hope. The memories crashed over him like waves. 10 years ago, the shriek of metal tearing through the air, the blinding flash of flames, and the haunting echoes of panicked screams. It all replayed vividly in his mind, each moment etched into his consciousness like scars on his soul. The moment the plane had plummeted, he had fought to breathe, choking on smoke and fear as he clawed his way from the wreckage. Shadows flickered in the flames, disembodied whispers curling around him, weaving tales of loss and despair that haunted him in the stillness of the night. "Ethan!" A voice jolted him from his reverie. His therapist, Dr. Miller, had warned him about the triggers, the sounds, the sights, the smells, but nothing could prepare him for the relentless nightmares. He felt their weight, the burden of survival that he carried like an anchor. As he stepped through the jet bridge, the stale scent of the aircraft reminded him of death. With each step, he fought against the tightness in his chest, the memory of ghostly figures emerging from the flames to taunt him. They whispered secrets he dared not repeat, taunting him with accusations. "You lived, but why?" The thought made his skin crawl. Ethan's heart raced as he found his seat, the plane vibrating with life around him. He closed his eyes, trying to drown out the cacophony of voices echoing in his mind, but the whispers grew louder, more insistent. The flight attendants performed their safety demonstrations, their cheerful smiles starkly contrasting with the darkness lurking in Ethan's thoughts. He could almost hear their voices overlapping with those of the deceased. "Help us! We're still here." He glanced around at the other passengers, their faces appearing almost too cheerful, too oblivious. The plane began to taxi, and he felt a shiver run down his spine, as if the aircraft itself remembered the horrors of its past. As it rolled down the runway, he looked out the window, expecting to see the flames, the screams. The memories began to converge, reality blending into the phantoms of his past. The engines roared to life, and the world outside blurred into streaks of color. He felt the familiar rush of takeoff, yet beneath it lay an undercurrent of dread. The plane climbed higher, and with each passing moment, the whispers began to fade into an ominous silence. The echoes of his past lingered like shadows, waiting patiently for their moment to strike. The act closes with Ethan's heart pounding in his chest, the line between past and present blurring, leaving him to wonder if he could ever truly escape the ghosts of Flight 237. In the silence, he could almost hear them, a reminder that the horror was not just a memory, it was alive and waiting. As the plane climbed into the clear sky, Ethan closed his eyes, taking deep breaths to steady himself. He repeated a mantra in his mind: "You are safe. You are here. You are alive." But the reassuring cadence of his thoughts felt fragile, like a spider's web, threatening to shatter at the slightest breeze. He fought to maintain his focus, battling the rising tide of anxiety that threatened to drown him. Moments passed, and the flight attendants glided through the cabin, offering drinks and snacks. Ethan forced a smile, trying to appear normal. But then he opened his eyes, and his heart dropped. Sitting across the aisle was a woman he recognized, the flight attendant from that fateful day. Her face was the same, strikingly beautiful yet ghostly pale, as if the very essence of her had been stripped away. She smiled, but it was a smile tinged with sorrow and anger, a silent accusation lodged in the depths of her gaze. Panic surged within him. How can this be happening? He blinked and she was gone. The man in the seat next to him raised an eyebrow, sensing his discomfort. Ethan forced himself to look away, glancing down the aisle, but the sight sent chills down his spine. There they were, the faces of the lost. One by one, the ghosts began to materialize among the passengers. There was the mother with her child, their hands clasped tightly, the boy's innocent face juxtaposed against the horror that loomed over them. He felt a knot tighten in his throat as he recalled the image of her screams, echoing in his mind like a tragic symphony. And there, sitting further back, was the businessman, a briefcase still clutched in his lifeless hands, his expression a mixture of confusion and anger. Ethan could feel the weight of the man's eyes on him, and he squirmed in his seat, desperate to look away. These were not mere figments of his imagination. They were ghosts anchored to their pain, and they had come to reclaim what was lost. The cabin grew cold, and an unsettling silence enveloped him as the other passengers remained blissfully unaware of the macabre gathering unfolding around them. Ethan felt their collective gaze upon him, heavy and accusatory, each one harboring a story that had been ripped away too soon. "Why did you survive?" Their silent voices echoed in his mind. He swallowed hard, trying to shake off the cold sweat gathering at the nape of his neck. The plane hit a pocket of turbulence and the cabin rattled violently, as if reflecting the tempest raging within him. The lights flickered, and for a moment, he saw them clearly, their faces contorted with agony, longing, and sorrow. "Ethan?" The flight attendant's voice cut through the haze. He turned toward her, entranced. As she stepped closer, her presence a haunting reminder of the life he had escaped. "You have to remember us. You can't run away from what happened." The weight of her words crashed into him, igniting memories he had tried to bury deep. He felt the overwhelming urge to scream, to protest, to deny their existence. But deep down, he knew they were real. They were not just lost souls. They were the ghosts of his past, intertwined with his fate, demanding recognition and revenge. As the turbulence intensified, the cabin shook violently, throwing passengers against their seats. Ethan gripped the armrests, his knuckles turning white. "Leave me alone," he shouted, his voice barely above a whisper, swallowed by the chaos. The ghosts moved closer, their faces a tapestry of grief and resentment surrounding him, their whispers rising into a mournful wail. "Help us," they pleaded, their voices blending into a chilling chorus. "You owe us the truth." Ethan squeezed his eyes shut, fighting against the tide of memories flooding his mind. He was trapped, not just in a plane, but within the very fabric of his guilt, reliving the moment they had perished while he escaped. The storm outside mirrored the turmoil within, a reminder that the past could not be ignored. The act culminates with Ethan's internal struggle as he grapples with the truth of their presence. The ghosts are not merely haunting him, they are seeking closure, and the realization begins to dawn on him. He must confront their stories or be consumed by the shadows of his past forever. The plane jolted violently, but was tossing passengers like ragdolls. Ethan's heart raced as panic surged through him, and the once familiar cabin transformed into a nightmarish landscape. The overhead lights flickered erratically, plunging the cabin into moments of darkness, amplifying the mounting terror that enveloped him. He could hear the flight attendants' voices crackling over the intercom, but their words were drowned out by the cacophony of fear that filled his mind. The ghosts pressed closer, their faces now clear in the dim light, revealing the anguish etched into their features. Ethan struggled to comprehend their presence. They were not just figments of his imagination, but manifestations of his deepest fears and regrets. Why had he survived when they hadn't? The question pulsed through his thoughts, wrapping around him like a noose. "Why did you let us die?" the flight attendant accused, her voice sharp and haunting. "You were supposed to save us." "No, I tried," Ethan shouted, but his voice wavered, betraying his uncertainty. He had fought to escape the wreckage, clawing through smoke and chaos, yet the echoes of their screams haunted him, a relentless reminder that he had left them behind. The plane bucked again, and the atmosphere turned electric. He felt the icy grip of fear tightening around him as he faced the ghosts, each one a harbinger of the past that he had fought so hard to bury. Their eyes pierced through him, revealing not just anger but sorrow, a desperate plea for acknowledgement. "Tell our stories," the mother pleaded, her child still clutched in her arms, frozen in the moment before the flames engulfed them. "You owe us that much." "Help us find peace," the businessman roared, his voice echoing in the chaos. The words hit Ethan like a physical blow, the rawness of their pain cutting through the shroud of his fear. Suddenly, the plane lurched violently, and a deep rumble resonated through the cabin as the turbulence worsened. Ethan grasped the armrests, his breath coming in short gasps. The walls of the aircraft felt as if they were closing in on him, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. "You can't escape us." "Face us!" A chorus of voices cried, overlapping and swelling like an approaching storm. The air turned heavy with grief and rage, and Ethan felt himself slipping into the dark abyss of their collective sorrow. The turbulence reached a fever pitch, causing the passengers to scream and grasp for stability, but all he could do was stare into the hollow eyes of the ghosts who surrounded him. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block them out, to block out the memories of their pain, but they surged forward, dragging him back into the past. The screams of the living blended with the wails of the dead, and Ethan found himself standing in the wreckage of Flight 237, flames licking at his heels as he watched the shadows of the damned flit through the smoke. "Why didn't you save us?" The question echoed around him, haunting and relentless, filling the air with a suffocating sense of doom. Ethan fell to his knees, overwhelmed, as the very memories he sought to escape crashed over him like a tidal wave pulling him under. He could feel the heat of the flames on his skin, the smoke choking his throat. He was trapped in a nightmare of his own making, surrounded by the very souls he had abandoned. The turbulence roared outside the aircraft, but within, a tempest of horror raged, the ghosts demanding retribution for the lives they had lost. With a cry of desperation, Ethan finally surrendered to the onslaught of memories. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to leave you," he yelled, the words spilling from him like a floodgate opening. "I'll tell your stories, I promise." In that moment, the cabin stilled, and the howling winds outside began to fade. The ghosts paused, their expressions shifting from anger to something softer, an understanding, perhaps. They had come not just to haunt him, but to demand recognition, to be remembered. The turbulence began to wane, and Ethan felt a strange sense of relief wash over him, as if a weight had been lifted. Yet he knew this was only the beginning. The true test awaited him as the ghosts remained, still lurking in the shadows, waiting for him to uncover the truth of their fates. The act concludes with a powerful realization. Ethan must confront the past and embrace the ghosts of his memories. The storm within him is not over, and the fight for his own redemption has just begun. As the turbulence subsided, Ethan sat in his seat, drenched in sweat, his heart pounding like a war drum in his chest. The cabin was eerily quiet now, a stark contrast to the chaos that had just unfolded. But the peace was deceptive. The ghosts still lingered, their forms flickering like candle flames, waiting for him to confront the truth. Ethan closed his eyes, willing his breath to slow, but the weight of their presence pressed heavily upon him. He could still feel their sorrow, their desperation hanging in the air like a thick fog. The flight attendant, whose name he had never known, stepped forward again, her eyes filled with anguish. "You must remember, Ethan. You cannot forget what happened that day." "I don't want to remember," he cried, the words bursting forth from a place of raw fear. He could almost hear the echoes of the flames crackling in his mind, the sound mingling with the distant memories of screams and desperate cries for help. "I can't." "But you must," the ghost insisted, her voice unwavering. "Only by facing it can you truly find peace, for us and for yourself. What happened that day is not just a memory, it's a truth you've buried. Let us help you unveil it." With those words, the atmosphere shifted, the dim light in the cabin flickering as if responding to the gravity of the moment. Suddenly, the familiar faces began to morph, shifting into the terrifying silhouettes of the day of the crash, each one filled with raw emotion. The air crackled with tension, and the ghosts coalesced into a vision of the wreckage, their final moments, encased in a haunting tableau. The plane shook as if the very essence of its past was demanding to be acknowledged. Ethan gasped as he found himself drawn into the vision, the heat of the flames lapping at his skin, the acrid smell of burning fuel choking him. He stood among the twisted metal and chaos, forced to confront the horror he had long tried to escape. "Help!" A scream pierced the air, and Ethan turned to see the woman from his nightmares, her child clutched in her arms, eyes wide with terror. He felt a gut-wrenching pull, the urge to reach out and save them, but he was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by the memories flooding back. Ethan could hear the crackle of the fire and the distant sounds of sirens wailing, but more haunting were the whispers of the passengers, filled with fear and desperation. "We trusted you," they echoed, their voices rising in a mournful crescendo. "You were our hope." A rush of guilt washed over him, crashing against his chest like a tidal wave. He realized in that moment that he had witnessed their final moments, But he had never truly faced the reality of their deaths. He had fled the scene, but their souls remained tethered to his, demanding recognition and solace. The flight attendant stepped closer, her presence grounding him amidst the chaos. "You need to understand, Ethan. We were scared. We had dreams, families, hopes. You must share our stories. You must bring us into the light." With newfound determination, Ethan focused on the ghostly figures, forcing himself to confront their pain. "Tell me your names," he urged, his voice trembling yet resolute. "Let me remember you. I promise I will share your stories." One by one, the spirits stepped forward, their names spilling from their lips like whispers on the wind. "I'm Sarah," the flight attendant said, her voice tinged with sorrow. "I was just doing my job." "David," the businessman spoke, his eyes piercing. "I was on my way to a meeting that would change my life." "Maria," the mother added softly, tears glimmering in her spectral eyes. "My son, Jason, he was only 6. With each name, Ethan felt the weight of their lives pressing upon him, their stories intertwining with his own. He could see flashes of their existence, moments of laughter, love and dreams unrealized. Their faces began to transform, revealing the humanity behind the tragedy, and he could no longer separate himself from their pain. "I'm sorry," Ethan said, his voice breaking, tears streaming down his face. "I wish I could have saved you. I wish I had done more." The ghosts gathered around him, their expressions shifting from anger to understanding, as if acknowledging his willingness to confront the truth. The heat of the flames faded, replaced by a profound stillness, the air heavy with the weight of their shared grief. "Thank you," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible above the silence. "You are the first to remember us." As the vision began to fade, Ethan found himself back in the plane, the atmosphere transformed from chaos to a serene calm. The turbulence had ceased entirely, but the shadows of the past remained, woven into the very fabric of his being. The ghosts were still there, now serene, waiting for him to continue the journey he had started. The act concludes with Ethan standing at the precipice of his redemption, armed with the names and stories of the lost. He understands that acknowledging their truth is not just a way to heal himself, but also a means to honor their memories, providing them with the recognition they desperately sought. The battle for closure is not over, but he feels a glimmer of hope. Perhaps he can finally let them go. As the plane glided smoothly through the sky, Ethan sat quietly, the weight of the past heavy on his heart, but tempered by a newfound resolve. The air felt different, charged with an electricity that hummed softly around him, a feeling that the ghosts were no longer hostile, but rather guiding him towards closure. He took a deep breath, allowing himself to absorb the names and stories that swirled within him like a tempest, each one deserving of recognition and remembrance. Yet as he glanced around the cabin, he noticed that some passengers were still oblivious, their faces locked in a peaceful slumber, while others appeared unsettled, their eyes flickering with unease. The contrast was jarring, and for a moment Ethan wondered if anyone else could feel the lingering presence of the lost. He sensed the ghosts standing close, their silent support surrounding him as he prepared for the next step of his journey. With a sudden burst of determination, he reached for the call button, signaling the flight attendant. When she approached, he looked into her eyes, now filled with compassion instead of accusation. "I need to share something," he began, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "I need to tell the stories of those we lost on Flight 237. The attendant nodded, understanding dawning on her face. "You're not alone," she replied softly. "Many of us carry those stories within us. Let's share them together." With that encouragement, Ethan took a deep breath, standing up in the aisle to face the passengers. The plane felt like a sanctuary, a sacred space where he could honor the memories of those who had perished. "Everyone," he called out, his voice gaining strength, "I need you to listen. I want to share the names and stories of those who didn't survive." Murmurs spread through the cabin, heads turning as the other passengers focused their attention on him. He felt a rush of adrenaline as he began to speak, each name echoing through the air, intertwining their lives with his. Sarah, the flight attendant who cared for us, even in her final moments. He could see the flicker of recognition in the eyes of the passengers as he continued. David, the businessman chasing his dreams. He felt the stories weaving together, creating a tapestry of lives intertwined with his own. Maria, a mother who only wanted to protect her son. Jason, He paused, taking a deep breath as the weight of her story settled in the air. He was just a little boy. He loved superheroes. They never got to live out their dreams, but we can remember them. Ethan's voice grew stronger as he delved deeper into the narratives, the flames of their past illuminating the cabin like a warm glow. The ghosts stood beside him, their expressions shifting from sorrow to something more profound. Relief, perhaps. Each story he shared breathed life into their memories, honoring their struggles and sacrifices. As he spoke, the atmosphere in the cabin shifted. A sense of unity enveloped them, a collective understanding that transcended the boundaries of life and death. The passengers began to murmur, sharing their own stories, their own connections to loss and survival. The plane transformed into a space of healing, where grief was acknowledged, and the spirits of the departed were welcomed into the light. In the midst of this awakening, the cabin lights flickered once more, and Ethan could feel the presence of the ghosts growing stronger. They moved among the passengers, their faces illuminated by the glow of shared humanity. "Thank you," he could hear them whispering, their voices intertwining with the sounds of acceptance and understanding. But as the plane continued to soar, a sudden drop in altitude caused the passengers to gasp, panic flashing across their faces. Ethan's heart raced as the turbulence returned, this time more violent than before. The ghosts too seemed unsettled, their forms flickering in and out, reflecting the chaos in the cabin. "Ethan!" Sarah's voice broke through the noise, sharp and clear. "You need to finish what you started. Don't let fear take control." In that moment, he understood. This was the ultimate test. The ghosts had come to remind him that confronting the past was not just about telling their stories, it was also about confronting his own fear of the unknown. He needed to stand firm in the face of the turbulence, to acknowledge the darkness, but also to embrace the light that came with it. "Listen," Ethan shouted, his voice rising above the chaos. "We are not defined by our past. We are defined by how we honor those we've lost. We must remember, not just for them, but for ourselves." The turbulence began to ease as his words echoed through the cabin, resonating with the passengers. They nodded, faces reflecting the collective understanding that had emerged from the depths of fear. In that moment, they all became witnesses to the truth, the acknowledgement of loss intertwined with the promise of hope. As the plane stabilized, Ethan felt the weight of the ghost lift. The cabin lights flickered gently, illuminating the faces of the passengers, now united in their shared grief and newfound strength. The spirits smiled at him, their forms glowing softly, as if releasing the pain that had tethered them to the earth. They were free. "Thank you," Ethan whispered, tears streaming down his face as he felt their presence fading gently. "I will never forget you." With that, the ghosts began to dissipate, merging into the air like wisps of smoke, their final act of love woven into the fabric of his being. He felt lighter, as if the burden of their stories had transformed into something beautiful, an eternal bond forged through loss and remembrance. The act concludes with Ethan standing amidst the passengers, no longer just a survivor but a beacon of hope, united in their shared humanity. He realized that while the scars of the past would always remain, they were now a part of his journey, a reminder of the lives he carried forward. As the plane continued its journey through the sky, he understood that they would always be with him, their stories echoing in the wind, a testament to resilience and the enduring power of love.